Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the conversation I have for you today. My guest today is someone who I have wanted to talk to for a long time. His work had and continues to have a profound effect on the way I think about things. His name is Daniel Pinchbeck. He is a writer. He is a philosopher. I guess you could call him a futurist. He's someone who writes a lot about the position that we're in as a human species on the planet, where we're going, where we've been. He's one of those writers that takes things on from a very, very wide, even cosmic or universal perspective. I think one of the words that people might associate with him is psychedelic. That's because his first book, Breaking Open the Head, which I recommend to anyone that is kind of looking for an introduction to these topics. Breaking Open the Head came out in, I think, about 2002, right after 9/11, and had a big effect on me and the way I saw a lot of those events and saw the Bush years unfold in kind of a surreal, psychedelic way. Breaking Open the Head is a book that takes kind of a journalist perspective on psychedelic drugs and indigenous shamanism and takes those subjects very seriously. And for that was really refreshing for me, because, I had some experience with those drugs in college, but never really had the context to take them seriously or really understand them in a way that could draw meaning from them. But they always stuck with me. And Pinchbeck's work kind of led me into a period in my 20s where I thought a lot about those drugs and thought a lot about kind of the intersection of psychedelic thinking and the surreal politics and historical reality that was unfolding in front of me. So, as we enter into the Trump era, Pinchbeck's writing resonates again with me. I find myself drawn again into some of the weirder, more esoteric, philosophical, psychedelic perspectives on what's happening. His second book, Pinchbeck's second book, was called 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, that took on the 2012 prophecy and the Mayan calendar, a lot of that stuff. Really, really fascinating set of ideas that he was playing with there. And his book that's coming out this spring, early 2017, is called How Soon Is Now? From Personal Initiation to Global Transformation, in which I think he kind of puts together a lot of the ideas that he's been playing with and puts them into a kind of set of ideas for practices that might turn around the mothership, and by that I mean something that might help us deal with the global climate catastrophe, which has been a big subject for Daniel's work. Has been the climate crisis and the effect of capitalism, and particularly industrial capitalism on speeding up a process that's destroying the planet and destroying our ability to live on it. But even more so is kind of, maybe not even more so, but at the same time, and tied up with that, is a kind of personal, individual, cultural sickness that Trump is just one particularly grotesque symptom of. So a lot of great ideas, and I hope I did a somewhat decent job of bringing out how compelling Daniel Pinchbeck's work is, because this was a fun conversation. It was really great to finally sit down with him and talk about this stuff. So I hope you enjoy this. There's a lot more Nostalgia Trap on the way. I'm going to take a brief break, and there will be more episodes coming in January, a lot more episodes, including a new format for the show with a whole bunch of added history stuff, and I hope you enjoy what's coming. We're putting together a new reboot of the Nostalgia Trap that should be very interesting. So I hope you enjoy that, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is me talking with Daniel Pinchbeck.
Born in New York Hospital, but when I was born, my parents lived on St. Mark's Place.
Okay.
They lived on, the same block as W.H. Auden and Thelonious Monk. And I'm 50 years old, so I was born in 1966. It was the heart of the 60s in the village.
So you come of consciousness not until maybe the early 1970s, I would say, kind of understanding what's around you, being a young child. Is there a moment that you remember kind of understanding that you you were living in a place and around people that were kind of unique?
I don't think you really think about that much as a child. I mean, and I've written about so my father was a sculptor and a painter, an abstract artist. And when I was young, he was painting these huge paintings of just squares and rectangles on kind of single colored surfaces. And we moved to Green Street. He had one of these big unreconstructed lofts at a time when there were no galleries or stores in Soho. And, I just had this sense that what he was doing was somehow like a necessary thing, that this was what, adults were supposed to do, was create these kind of like totemic, answers to whatever they saw around them. I don't know.
Wow.
So I don't think I really thought about it as being unique or unusual for a very long time.
That it was just your dad's job to somehow abstract the world in art.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I figured everybody's dad probably did that.
Your life intersects a little bit with the kind of like Beat Generation counterculture of the 60s, right? I mean, I know your mom is Joyce Johnson, who some of my readers or some of my listeners probably do know as someone who's connected to Kerouac and that whole generation.
Yeah.
Was that something you were aware of as a kid?
Sure. I mean, my mother had gone out with Jack Kerouac in 1957 when she was 21 and he was 34. And she was with him off and on for about a year and a half. And he was staying with her when On the Road came out.
Wow.
And became a bestseller and launched him. The New York Times proclaimed it like the masterpiece of his generation. But she also saw that kind of destroy him because he was an alcoholic and very defenseless in a way. And suddenly he was on all these TV talk shows and getting all this fame, and it kind of accelerated his unfortunate, kind of self-destructive habits.
Yeah, I never really thought about Jack Kerouac as and connecting him to like Kurt Cobain, but the idea of like fame kind of draining these people and like taking these artists and like kind of crushing them to the point of actual death. It's kind of amazing. So your mom has a book called Minor Characters that I just want to kind of mention really quickly as like one of the, when I was first working on like Beat Generation stuff at the CUNY Graduate Center, that book was connected so much for me, like put together a lot. I think it's still kind of one of the like canonical books about that era.
Yeah, I maybe I'm biased, but I think it's definitely a small masterpiece. I mean, it won the National Book Critics Circle Award, and she wrote a number of other books. She just recently wrote a biography of Kerouac of the first half of his life, ending in I think the 50s, maybe even early, maybe even 49. She was very fascinated by the influence of his French-Canadian heritage on his language and his thought and so on.
Yeah, I mean, his relationship with his mother is like so important. I think they spoke French almost, I don't know if exclusively, but a lot. So, I mean, do you go to high school here in New York?
Yeah, I went to Bank Street School for Children, which is a progressive school on 112th Street, and then I went to Columbia Prep. I moved to the Upper West Side with my mother, and she was working as a book editor, so I sort of toggled between her world, which was kind of like, feminist book agents and editors and writers. And she edited like Abby Hoffman's first book and Ron Kovic's Born on the 4th of July.
Oh, wow. So I didn't know that.
Free to Be You and Me was one of her books. And then my father's world, which were all these kind of artists living in these unreconstructed lofts, drinking too much.
That's a world to be surrounded by. I mean, how did you fit into that as you're getting to be a teenager and starting to, I don't know, starting to come to terms with drugs, alcohol, sex, art, and stuff like that? Did you think of yourself as kind of apart from that, or that was the world that you were going to enter into?
Yeah, but I guess I always assumed that I would be part of that cultural world. My best friends growing up were identical twin brothers who lived in Chelsea, and their parents were the actors Rip Torn and Geraldine Page. So, and we were all actually kind of, in a way, late bloomers. Like, I had a bacterial infection in my spine when I was 12, so I was in the hospital for a number of months. So I didn't really get kind of, I was sort of set back a little bit. Like, and we were, my group of friends were all very into like, art house films, and there were a lot more revival cinemas and so on, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different, and in some ways, do you feel like it was a different New York City that you grew up in than the New York of today? I mean, it's something that's come up on this podcast a lot. Is it's kind of like, I don't know, this romanticization of the kind of like dirty East Village of the 1970s and 80s, and how there was like, despite the dirtiness, a more kind of robust art scene. Do you feel that's true?
Well, I don't really hold on to that kind of, or I really try not to hold on to that kind of sentimentality. I don't think it's very useful, and I kind of agree although I've never read much Hegel, there's one quote of him that I really like where apparently he said there's no such thing as unrealized potential. So, I mean, there was a great scene. And actually, my dad got really into New Wave, so we would go to like Max's Kansas City together. Max's? No, it was CBGB's and some of the underground clubs and so on. And so I saw a little of that, But I mean, that was a great, it was an interesting cultural moment. And now we're in this cultural moment, which is also quite interesting.
Right. Are you? Is there a point in your youth that you kind of are thinking about writing, that you might be a writer?
It was actually, for whatever reason, it was the only thing that I ever really thought seriously about doing. And somehow I was just aimed in that direction. That was the one thing that I wanted to do. And I went to college at Wesleyan in Connecticut. Then I dropped out after maybe a year and a half. And then I worked in magazines through my mother's connections. I got an internship at an art magazine, and then I worked my way up kind of the magazine ladder and started doing freelance journalism. And I was writing poetry and fiction on the side. And I had some friends who I worked with on a literary magazine, and we published a literary magazine for like 10 years called Open City. And so I was part of like the New York media, literary
scene. In what is this, like the mid 80s, late 80s?
This is yes, it would be, I see 66, 86. Yeah, it would be the 80s and early 90s, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's like for me, I mean, I don't know a whole lot about that scene beyond stuff that I've gleaned from culture and like reading like, I don't know, Bret Easton Ellis and things like that, but it feels like a cocaine-y scene. I don't know if that's true, but it feels like a scene that's kind of like driven in part by a really kind of, I don't know, robust party scene.
I wrote about that in Breaking Open the Head, that I felt that, I guess in retrospect, there was a kind of nihilistic undercurrent. And one of my good friends was the publisher of our literary magazine, came from a very wealthy background, like a newspaper dynasty in the South. And he was a very brilliant, but sort of maybe scared person. I don't know. But he ended up kind of accidentally killing himself with a heroin overdose, which was definitely a crucial event in my own development, recognizing that, that kind of dead end.
Yeah, burnout. I mean, take me back to Wellesley. I mean, that's a very
Wesleyan.
Wesleyan. That's a very particular kind of scene, that would have been like the early '80s or late '70s that you were there.
No. I guess 66 to 86. So I was 20. I was like 84. I would have graduated. So I was there like 80 to 82 or something like that.
Did you like it or didn't like it? It seems like you didn't
right?
if you left.
So bad at numbers. 16. No, that's 84. I got there at 84. I really didn't like it very much. I mean, it had a psychedelic background. It was the first place where I tried mushrooms and LSD and so on. But I just, in some ways, I felt like my psychological, emotional development was a little slow, partially because of that experience with the back injury. And then my intellectual, cultural development was kind of ahead. So I was kind of caught being sort of ahead in some ways and behind in others, and just struggling with some of my own personal stuff. And, Well,
and this is also, I mean, this is Reagan years. How were you relating to that stuff? I mean, I assume you weren't a Reagan supporter, but
particularly in the new book, actually, I go back and think about it. Like, I think there was a general sense in that generation of kind of total political hopelessness.
Yeah,
which I guess is probably still the same for millennials today. But the sense that there was really, I didn't grow up with any sense that you could productively kind of intervene in the political thing. It just seemed like that was just a juggernaut. And then, in a way, the best thing to do was to find like solace in culture and self-expression.
It seems like a lot of people were doing that even post '60s. Was that a lot of that generation came to the end of feeling like they could do anything practically about the political system and went off into kind of like, I mean, communes and lifestyle and culture and kind of like figuring there's another way out of this. It's also kind of like, for me, it's like, who wants to spend their whole lives trying to fight this like system that just seems completely like it's not moving, like it's not movable at all. So you mentioned like mushrooms and LSD. Those first experiences in college. I mean, did they do anything for you? Because I mean, eventually you get those that know your work know that you eventually write about psychedelics in a much more kind of formal way. But what were your initial experiences?
Well, I mean, once again, something that I have covered a lot, probably like all the books. But I think that, and even like the Beats talked about this, like Ginsberg and so on. Like when you take mushrooms, real LSD, there's like a sense of deconditioning, like you peeling away from, we're in the second nature of culture. As Terence McKenna said, culture is our operating system, but people forget about that. They're just they're like fish swimming in the sea of like social conventions and cultural conventions. And so they're not aware that they're artifices. And I remember the first experience of mushrooms was like, plants and, clouds make sense, but buildings and cars are constructed in a way that's kind of ridiculous, and the money that we're using that is like the focus of this whole society is totally absurd.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a couple of my students this week about, because I was trying to explain to them about kind of how drugs like marijuana and LSD became connected to a kind of larger social and political awakening in the 60s, and that they said, and my students were like, people didn't do drugs before the 60s. And I thought, in the 50s, people did a lot of drugs. I mean, specifically like alcohol and pills, right? Like downers, barbiturates, and Valium, and things like that. And that's kind of understanding a little bit of the difference, like in terms of those drugs that sedate you and let you accept the artifice versus the drugs that kind of like make you feel like there is an artifice and point it out to you. Are these thoughts that were occurring to you at all when you're having your first experience with psychedelics, or did it take a while to kind of get to that point? Because the reason I say that is because you come from this kind of like, I don't know, this beat East Village scene where drugs are a part of that history a lot.
But I think that I was very amazed by psychedelics when I tried them when I was around 19 and 20. And I sort of had a feeling, an intuition that it was something I was going to go back and revisit.
Right.
But then I sort of got swirled up into, what am I supposed to do with my life? So I was working in magazines. And it was only when I had like kind of a existential crisis, more in my late 20s, that I realized that I wanted to go back and look at those experiences again and try to figure out what they were about.
And I know this territory that you've written about is primarily in Breaking Open the Head, which is kind of, I mean, in a way, it's a memoir. I feel like Breaking Open the Head is a lot about your life, right?
I mean, I guess all my books have that aspect to them. The new one probably a little bit less so, but even there. And partially that's because, I think that I guess it's part of the literary tradition, I guess, that I came through. Like my mother's work is very personal, and the beats were always about kind of, authentic expression of your own truth as kind of the only thing that you can trust in a way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that. And coming from the academic world, which is kind of like the opposite of that in some way, I want the person in on the page when I'm reading. I want to hear those personal connections. I want to know who is it that's making these points. I think it's an important part of it. Like, I don't know, the first time I met or encountered, I didn't meet, but encountered in real life, like a thinker like Slavoj Žižek. You've probably heard of this guy. His writing is brilliant, but as a person, he's just kind of like this. It just kind of made me think of him differently to meet him as a personality. And all I mean by that is kind of like the personality seems important even when you're thinking about theoretical stuff. It seems like connecting it to who you actually are and what your lived experience is. Kind of, I don't know.
I suppose. I mean, there is, kind of the more European modernist construct of the great artist is also like the monster who chain smokes and
that's right,
sorts of crazy things, and I mean there's the almost like a possession trance of genius or something,
right. And does it even matter who the person is at all? The separation of the art and the artist is another element of that, because there is the notion. I mean, I've had this argument many times with people. It's kind of like, should we care who the artist is? Should we care at all? Like that this person was an abusive alcoholic when their paintings are so compelling and so beautiful and have so much value to us. Does it matter to us? Those things. I mean, those are not easy questions to answer, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, I mean. This whole construct of how we think about individuality and rebellion and genius, may all be time sensitive. It may have to do with a certain paradigm, that maybe, we're going to exit at some point. So I don't think that was the case in like the classical world or something. Like the people who were, probably, building the pyramids or whatever were not also the most destructive abusers.
Right.
Yeah.
Who are some of the thinkers that start to pop out to you? Because, and I'm talking about like when you're in the midst of this existential crisis that I think came about in part from just being in that literary world and the personal things that are going on with you. I mean, at what point do you start to kind of like look to thinkers, philosophers, writers as a kind of way to get out of that?
It's a good question. Well, I mean, ultimately, the thinkers and writers that I cared about really changed dramatically.
Yeah, right.
Because, I mean, I was more into like literary modernism. I mean, I still love, stuff like Thomas Bernhard and George Perec and kind of Nabokov and so on. But, I ultimately what my first book kind of expresses is a transition in worldview from the kind of secular materialist worldview that, more or less all those modernist writers share to kind of more of an acceptance of a mystical or Gnostic or shamanic or Jungian perspective on the nature of reality.
Was it surprising to you that you found yourself getting into a mystical, shamanic kind of way of being?
Well, it was very surprising. I mean, my father had some interest in some of that stuff, but, my mother was very against anything mystical. She felt that like the, Buddhism of Kerouac and his friends was a form of avoidance of their own psychological problems. And
wow.
So on. So, and I'd seen myself as a hard-headed, skeptic materialist.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, in a way, Breaking Open the Head is so effective, is because, you're really, you're reading this, change that I'm going through, while writing it.
Well, in the years since Breaking Open the Head came out, I mean, there's been a rise in a kind of like really strident cultural atheism. I guess they call it the new atheism online, that does kind of take that secular materialist viewpoint and takes it almost to its logical extreme. Has that development been something that surprised you? Like, I'm talking about the Richard Dawkins and even Bill Maher that just have this kind of attitude of like, things are the way they are. Anyone who thinks outside of that is crazy, essentially. All religion is basically human stupidity. I mean, they have a really... I don't like these guys. I mean, they're obnoxious to me. But has that been something that surprised you, that development?
No, I think our culture was already pretty much like that.
Yeah. Well, we have a religious culture, though, in some respects.
What's that?
America has a religious culture, though. Not everyone is.
I was never part of any religious culture. My parents had rejected religion. There was just cultural... I mean, the closest approximation to, any kind of spirituality was basically, art.
Right,
cultural expression. Self-expression.
I mean, the reason I bring up that atheism thing is because it seems the rise of that kind of cultural thing, especially online, of that obnoxious kind of anti-religious thing, is it seems just in stark contrast to how you see things and what your work is about.
Yeah, well, I mean, particularly in the second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, I really seek to develop what seems to me a more truly rational understanding that encompasses, for instance, the discoveries of quantum physics, which a lot of those secular atheists are like stalwart in rejecting.
Yeah.
The idea that the fact that we now know that like the observer and the object are interdependently related, and so on. They reject all of that as having any value because they say it's just quantum phenomenon, doesn't have any effect on the macro level.
Right.
But I think more and more there's more and more people coming from more and more angles who are finding and some of it is like myth making or storytelling, articulating. In a way, science itself is a myth making process, right?
Yeah.
Like. So but the myths have to correspond, as better and better to what we can experience and know, and how we can think about the world. So I feel that there's a closing of the gap now between mysticism and science.
It seems like that's been important to you in your work, is kind of reconciling reconciling that kind of like shamanic, mystical worldview with a kind of like practical material science. Like, in other words, you don't totally reject the idea that a kind of scientific method or a kind of way of proving things does have some value.
Yeah, no, of course not. I mean, our for all we know, our science is still in its infancy, right? Like, with only 400 years, which is like a blip of tiny time, and and I think there are, like, Rupert Sheldrake is one person. He wrote a book called The Science Delusion. Kind of a reply to the God delusion. Is that Dawkins or whatever? But looking at the different kind of unexamined kind of myths that underlie the scientific, the narrow version of the scientific method that's now accepted as truth.
And Sheldrake, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Sheldrake is one of the people that I feel like connects to your work in the sense of you're often pointing out kind of these phenomena that everybody experiences, like synchronicity, kind of uncanny dreams, all sorts of other kind of things that most people accept as kind of everyday psychic phenomenon. Sheldrake actually gets in there and comes up with is it morphogenetic fields, right? Yeah, he came up with the kind of concept of how to explain that scientifically. That I think a lot of people don't understand that these are like peer-reviewed papers.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing. I mean, a lot of this stuff has been borne out by science, which is weird to see these new atheists talk about science as this kind of like one monolithic place you go and say, well, science checks it out. But it seems like science has a lot of kind of conflicting information to tell us in some ways.
Yeah, and then also, there's still very much like the hard problem of consciousness. That science still doesn't really have an answer or an understanding of why this kind of self-awareness emerges at a certain level of complexity.
Yeah. When do you discover Terence McKenna?
I guess I discovered him when I was working on Breaking Open the Head. I think it was probably my friend Michael. It was my friend older poet, who introduced me to ayahuasca. Was probably also the one who introduced me to Terence's work. He certainly introduced me to Jose Arguelles, who in some ways has probably been more important to me than McKenna, although Arguelles is kind of lesser known at this point. But in some ways, I think he has deeper. I mean, he's a little crazier too, but deeper levels of insight maybe than McKenna.
Was it McKenna's? Was his books, his tapes? I mean, the way for listeners of the Nostalgia Trap who are following along, like kind of my own development with this stuff, with the same stuff that Daniel's talking about, is someone literally, it was like a drug deal. Someone handed me a tape, like a literal audio tape, and we're like, check this out. And it was called, all it said on it was handwritten, Linear Societies and Nonlinear Drugs. And it was such an intriguing title to me. And I remember listening to it and just the quality of his voice combined with the things that he was saying just absolutely hypnotized me. Did that happen to you too?
I mean, I'm always more of a textual person.
Yeah.
So I mean, I love his recordings, but probably, I needed to see things, in like text form. So Food of the Gods, True Hallucinations, The Archaic Revival, were all works that I like studied and thought about a lot. And he's a very engaging, captivating thinker. He kind of shows what happens when you kind of fully open yourself to psychedelic insight. Yeah. How it allows you to think in this kind of multidimensional spectrum. Whether all of his thoughts were good ones, probably not, but a lot of them are quite fascinating, and many people are still, resonating deeply with his work.
He's also someone who kind of emerged from the 1960s counterculture radical scene, I think in Berkeley, and kind of, I wish more people knew kind of who he was, because he kind of takes that legacy, that psychedelic legacy that's so kind of, I don't know, stereotyped in our culture. And he's the guy that kind of, I don't know, in some ways kind of put it together and put a kind of practical structure around how we think about this stuff. Do you go back to him at all now? Has it been a while? I
haven't gone back to him so much. I mean, my work has veered in a different direction because, essentially, like, I wrote Breaking Open the Head, and in that book I was forced to realize that, many of the things that our mainstream system and culture say about areas that are of utmost importance to the individual are absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
And therefore, I then had to think about the fact that we've suppressed and, in a sense, in many cases, destroyed, obliterated these other knowledge systems of traditional people, indigenous people, and that around the world, many of those indigenous cultures, even the most developed ones, had maybe access to different ways of understanding the nature of reality that are actually not, stupider than ours or more rudimentary, but they were just coming at it from a different angle that incorporated, maybe the right brain, intuition, visionary experience, and so on. And a lot of them had prophetic understanding of the nature of this time as being a time of, transformation, transmutation, destruction, recreation. So I felt that if I had understood that the shamanic experience was truly of legitimate value, and that there were these other realms of the psyche and even psychic, paranormal type experience and so on, occult experience, I then had to study and understand what these traditional cultures like the classical Maya and the Hopi, even the Hindu Vedic culture, what they, understood about how they saw our time and the nature of the world. So that was really the substance of the second book, the 2012 The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which was a 5-year undertaking. And then when I finished that book, I felt that I actually understood a lot more about what was meant and what was being said, and how truly, participatory the process that we're in is. And that, when we understand that, we have a kind of obligation to try to participate in bringing about the change that we would like to see.
Yeah.
Because at the moment, unfortunately, modern civilization is postmodern civilization is a suicide machine that's basically driving us towards extinction.
Yeah.
Probably, it's probably too late to avoid tremendous damage and loss, but, we can't keep going in this direction, for much longer. So then I recognized that, well, two things. I felt that, first of all, it wasn't enough just to be a writer anymore. So I felt that I had to try to create alternative media, alternative structures, networks to kind of help change people's consciousness and lifestyles. And then also I wanted to write one more book, which would be kind of like kind of a systems level overview, looking at the levels of the types of systemic change that would have to happen to avert, catastrophic failure of our support systems.
Is this the book that's coming out soon?
Yeah, exactly.
And this book is called
How Soon Is Now?
How Soon Is Now,
Yeah.
which I've always liked your sense of urgency, because it does feel like it's kind of bizarre that there's this kind of like widespread cultural acknowledgement that that the damage that we've done to the planet is fatal, and that we're in an ecological crisis, and yet there's strangely, I mean, the climate change and the environment didn't come up one time in any of the presidential or vice presidential debates. Zero. I mean, it's kind of to see that stagnant system in the face of such an emergency is very frustrating. Is this like your most political book, you think?
Well, it's political, but I mean,
because you've avoided engagement with that kind of like straight political world, and in part that's what I admire about your work, is that it kind of goes to other places and investigates kind of other, I don't know, another kind of perspective on how to make change.
Yeah, no, it's still, I mean, it tries to put forward a strategy, in a sense,
right,
along with a theory of change and a way of understanding, our current circumstances. But it's not like I'm suggesting that people, although they can if they want, obviously, go out and, staple themselves to the White House or something.
Right.
But it's more like seeing how we could maybe use the emergent tools and social technologies to kind of engineer a rapid shift of behavior practices, values, and ideals.
And I mean, it seems like you use, in part, you're kind of like, and I could be wrong about it because I haven't read your book, but I feel like I'm familiar with a lot of your work. But the idea that that the whole idea of like a shamanic initiation is something that could happen on like on a larger like collective level, like a cultural level, and that dealing with the ecological crisis could give us an opportunity to kind of engage in that.
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to the first book, I was writing, one of the big thinkers who inspired me was Walter Benjamin.
Yes.
And he had this idea that the First World War, by extension the Second World War, were actually events that were happening because there was an intrinsic necessity for human beings to kind of come into ecstatic contact with the cosmos.
I love that.
And this would either happen through kind of consciously designed ceremony and ritual, or it would happen unconsciously. It would be inflicted as like mass disaster and catastrophe. So, I mean, I extrapolated from that idea about those wars, and I think the same thing could be said around the ecological crisis, because we've known for like a half century that we were ravaging, depleting our natural environment, but we haven't been able to rally, and it's almost as if we're allowing this mega crisis to unfold with the hope that that'll catalyze some process of interchange.
Yeah. I mean, so it's like kind of people have to change.
But then also, if you look at what initiations are in tribal societies, once again, like our kind of prejudice is to think that they're purely cultural phenomena. Like, oh, that's cool. The kids are taken out and they're given drugs and they have to do a walkabout or they have a Sundance or whatever. But actually, it may be that those were tribes understood those as necessary, through thousands of years of trial and error, because they actually were necessary on almost like a neurocognitive level. That maybe the the neocortex can only reach its full functioning if there's a kind of culturally induced shock where the individual passes through a threshold of visionary or transpersonal experience. So they're no longer just locked into this limited ego identity. And the problem in our society is because we did away with initiations, people grow up, become adults, but they've never had that secondary shock of visionary experience.
Yeah.
So they kind of are just trapped in their self-centered, self-seeking ego identity. They don't have any sense of connection to anything larger, like a cosmic process or a greater community or a whole or something.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it's in a weird, ironic way, watching the development of social media and the internet. Even McKenna was really kind of utopic about talking about the development of the internet. Bless you. He thought that I mean, if you listen to, I think I listened to him maybe a year ago. The last time I listened to a McKenna tape, and I think it was one of the trialogues actually with Sheldrake and someone else. There's another guy.
Yeah. Was it Abraham?
Abraham, yeah. So McKenna was talking about how this whole notion of like finding the others and that social media, what it will do. And I mean, social media didn't even exist. He was like kind of prophesizing its existence. But he basically said that that this would allow people to come together in an unprecedented way, and it would make these connections. But we've also seen this kind of culture of social media turn people into turn people to narcissists, and kind of like almost reinforce a lot of the bullshit underlying cultural perceptions and ideas that capitalism produces. If that makes sense to you.
Totally. I mean, yeah, it seems like it is having both liberational, aspects and kind of regressive aspects at the same time.
The first time I heard the word ayahuasca and DMT was like in your work, and in the years since Breaking Open the Head came out, which was like 2002. Ayahuasca has become a cultural phenomenon in a way. I mean, it's kind of amazing. It used to be that I think that the only way you could get and have this experience would be to travel to South America, hook up with. I mean, you tell harrowing stories actually in your book about this experience. But now people are doing this like in the apartment next door. How has that been for you, watching that unfold and it becoming kind of an industry?
Well, I mean, it's almost like the growth of Burning Man and ayahuasca, have been sort of parallel phenomena, and. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I have to think that it's positive. And, not everybody has a shift in worldview when they do the medicine, but, some people do.
Yeah.
And, I see more people becoming sensitized to what's happening, particularly at very, high levels of like the financial and social system.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, people
doing ayahuasca on Wall Street?
People from very wealthy families or who've, made hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever, suddenly having an internal transformation.
It's kind of an interesting idea in terms of, I mean, 'cause we talk so much on this show about like, I don't know, confronting capitalism, and so many people look at that from a kind of like viewpoint of Marxism or socialism, but you're an anti-capitalist, right? I mean, assuming
that's a little simplistic. I mean, I think that, if we survive past this threshold, we'll understand that capitalism was like an adolescent phase in the life of our species. I mean, it's kind of like an adolescent growth, where you're pushing all the limits and, you're taking all the resources and so on. So, but it meshed the world together into a monoculture and built the roads, the satellites, the communication system, hopefully by creating these new tools of interactive communication, it's also kind of creating the ground for its transmutation into a more equitable and empathic kind of system.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember there's a section in Breaking Open the Head at the end where you do like kind of 3-paragraph riff on capitalism that I'll probably read at the beginning of this episode because I like the way you frame it. You frame it very close to like Terence McKenna in the sense of like, well, it just seems like a childish impulse in some respects, and it seems like a I mean, Terence McKenna just says he hates capitalism because it's stupid and a stupid way of organizing people and like setting people against each other and having them climb up a ladder that kind of goes nowhere and step on each other on the way up. But I appreciate the way that you frame it because it feels like capitalism is a system that needs that instead of ending needs to be transformed in some ways, and I like that impulse. Burning Man, a lot of like, I don't know, I get Marxist, leftist, radicals, they have a really kind of harsh criticism of Burning Man. I mean, there's a kind of like anti-hippie kind of already thing that I don't really care about that aspect of it, but more kind of like the element of like harsh criticism of like, Burning Man isn't doing anything. Burning Man is rich people partying out in the desert and kind of not engaging in the world and the political world and the social world of like what needs to be changed. But I don't think you see it that way. You don't see it as just like elite escapism. You have another kind of point of view on it.
I mean, I can understand all sorts of critiques of it, and I sort of incorporate them. Like Jacobin magazine had a piece last year where they talked about how it's a libertarian ethos that really the ones who have the money to build the camps and pay for the sculptures get to decide what the collective reality is for everybody else, just as in the mainstream society, the philanthro-capitalists now get to decide, where the aid goes. They get to sort of reshape, global society in their own image, and that's, I don't agree with that. I think we need a more truly, grassroots, participatory, decentralized type of democracy. So Burning Man mirrors some aspects of the dominant or dominator culture. However, it's also a window into a transformed society where even if you just experience that for a week, a decommodified society where art is the central basis of interaction, a gift-based system, radical inclusion. I mean, they created a set of 10 principles that are actually quite beautiful. They can probably add a couple to them, but it does create a different environment, a different ethos, and you see people. It also is a great kind of window into how malleable and flexible human nature is. Yeah. Because if people are given different game rules, suddenly they just totally transform. If they get more satisfaction from, sharing their, sake rather than just drinking it all themselves or whatever.
Right. I know. I've always liked that idea of like changing the game rules or culture as an operating system, the kind of idea of like...
Social sculpture is one of my ideas that I love from Joseph Beuys. I think we can look at everything as a social sculpture, and it's just, what the problem is that we, what the new book, How Soon Is Now, tries to do, in a sense, is suggest that, somebody like Steve Jobs, had the idea for an iPhone. Right. And he was like, okay, like, I want to have this incredible device. To do it, we'll need to learn how to do this, make factories that do that, convince, get this, minerals from here. We never really think about that in terms of our social system. Like, wouldn't we prefer to have a society where, everybody had enough to eat and a place to live, and where information was, freely available, and, people's creativity was being nurtured. I mean, we have the, enough technical oomph, to make that stuff happen. So how do we, use what we know about, institutional structures and financial systems and, everything else to kind of reverse engineer a kind of result that would actually make us make people much happier.
You mentioned the iPhone. I mean, do you see technology as playing an important role in this transformation that you're envisioning?
Yeah, on the most basic level, I think there's a deep interrelationship between evolution of consciousness and the evolution of technology. Mm-hmm. I think we're like a tool making and tool using species, and our tools reflect us back on ourselves and then give us new understandings that change.
Where is that idea? I've heard that idea. I feel like maybe I heard you say it before, but that idea of like technology leads us to the next technology in a sense. Like where we develop this tool, and that tool somehow shows us the way to what we need to make next. It's kind of a fascinating idea. It's kind of like, who's controlling that process?
Yeah. Who's controlling anything?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like a lot of people listening to this program, especially because it's so many, like, I don't know, political radicals and things like that, people that haven't done these drugs are very resistant to these ideas in some ways. Have you encountered that? Not necessarily from people that haven't done drugs, but like resistance to your ideas or dismissal of your ideas. I feel like, especially coming from that literary world you came from, there'd be a lot of friends you'd have that would think you're just off the reservation, nuts.
I mean, I've taken as part of my role, culturally, I guess, is to explore ideas that are far too out there for the mainstream paradigm, and take them seriously. And yes, I mean, that's, provoked some ridicule and so on. So, for instance, in the 2012 book, I had 100 pages about the crop circles, these patterns that appear in fields.
I forgot about your crop circle
thing. You never read the 2012 book, it sounds
like.
I
did.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I did. So, I haven't brought up 2012 yet because I want to talk about what 2012 is.
Got it. And I actually spoke at the Left Forum. And I talked
Did you really speak at Left Forum?
Crop circles.
Was this at like the Graduate Center?
Yeah, it was like a few years ago. And I never got invited back to give another talk. So I've had a lot of experiences like that where I kind of, express my views and then a door like slams shut because it's too much.
Yeah.
But I also consider that to be, kind of like what happens to like pioneers, like, you sort of get the arrows,
totally.
Then it becomes ultimately more acceptable, but it takes a while.
You're not a martyr, but I appreciate your sacrifice. Because, I mean, to me, I'm like, because I know what Left Forum is. I mean, it's at my school. And, like, I've been to it several times. And, like, I know the kind of stuff that there is a fight within the Left Forum about, like, the weird stuff. People want to get rid of the weird stuff, the kind of, like, what would be categorized as conspiracy theory and things like that. But crop circles? Where is your thinking gone with crop circles? Because like for a while, when you were writing about them, and when I was reading your book, 2012, that came out 07, 06? Yeah. I was really, just crop circles. I remember telling as many people as I could that this was to me one of the most significant phenomena on the planet. And then I kind of forgot about them.
Right.
What happened with crop circles with you?
Well, I mean, I totally am convinced that some of them are expressions or projections of some other kind of interdimensional or galactic intelligence. Yeah. And it's I'm
okay with that.
A sign system. Like why, like this whole, it's kind of funny because, all these scientists are like, oh, if there were extraterrestrials out there, why wouldn't they communicate with us? Then there are these huge things, inexplicable things that appear every summer, where physicists have done studies on what happens to the crops in the fields and discovered they're affected by like an electromagnetic energy in a certain way and so on. So but that's all that I really need to know for the time being.
Yeah.
Like, and for me, like the message is that, if humanity can break the mind-forged manacles that are now holding us and reconstruct our society so that it's non-destructive and kind of integrally connected back to the ecology of the earth, we may then find that we are, able to commune with benevolent other world civilizations.
Yeah, I think one of the most compelling things that kind of for me like explained a phenomena that I've been kind of struggling to think about my whole life and been fascinated with my whole life is the idea of like the gray alien that I think you wrote about in 2012.
Yeah.
I think you kind of came to terms a little bit with like what that is. There's a book by what is it? Is it Whitley Strieber? Yeah, called Communion that. Kind of does a similar thing where it's kind of framing this as a somewhat psychic phenomenon, but Jung has a book about UFOs. It's kind
Flying
of like
saucers.
Yeah, that does this kind of gives you an entryway into understanding this.
Jung is really the great modern shaman of the 20th century.
Yeah,
he was able to take all these phenomena and understand that they were all phenomena in the psyche, that everything is actually a phenomenon in the psyche somehow. So he saw the flying saucers as kind of archetypes of the collective unconscious, the round shape related to like the mandalas and dreams, and the round shape kind of representing the psychic wholeness that we're seeking.
And if I'm correct, Jung is writing about the kind of like growth of sightings of flying saucers around World War II.
Yeah, a little
right?
Yeah.
Which connects so beautifully with that Walter Benjamin idea of kind of this like World War II as this kind of, I don't know, initiation moment or a cosmic moment. It's kind of really, really creepy, amazing stuff to make those connections. I mean, remind me in 2012 what you were saying about gray aliens now.
Well, it's a lot to it. But there's a relation between those, manifestations that many people report, and the traditional stories of like fairies and goblins that even like Shakespeare talked about, but that it took this kind of like postmodern, sinister, technological kind of form. And I just read a lot of books around hypnotherapists who've been working with patients and so on, and it seemed like there are weird things about the Greys, like. For an extraterrestrial civilization, they seem to have no history, no psychology. There's something extremely like flat about them.
Yeah.
And I began to consider the idea that they were almost more like a form of bacteria that operates on the level of consciousness, that's sort of like breaking down like sterile, or stagnant matter, rather than literally like a developed extraterrestrial civilization,
right?
Which
that
would have
that are literally getting in spaceships and coming here physically.
Yeah.
There instead, I think it's a much more to me compelling and maybe precise vision of how this might work. Because that idea of like, I don't know, them kind of like they're not really good at holding themselves together physically, and they always seem like they're coming apart, or even wearing cardboard suits. I mean,
there's all sorts of crazy stuff.
It's insane.
Yeah, but I mean, and anyways, I feel bad because we began this digression with you talking about how leftists and radicals are not going to be into what I'm saying, and now we've got straight into the stuff that they're probably going to be most.
Oh, I don't care.
Rejecting.
Yeah, that's fine.
But no, but I'm actually, hopeful in. Particularly with the new book, in engaging in a truly productive kind of dialogues. I think the book synthesizes, like, I got Antonio Negri and David Graeber and so on.
Okay, well, let's put away the aliens then, and the shit that gets you kicked out of Left Forum. Because that's why I asked you, like, is this your most political work? I know there's different ways of thinking about what is a political work, but it sounds like you are like coming to terms with the system in a kind of more practical way in this book.
Yeah, well, I mean, I sort of see there's three main kind of wheels that all kind of turn together, and one is like the technical infrastructure, like energy, agriculture, industry, transport, and then there's the political economic system, and then there's, consciousness, culture, ideology. And basically it's the same breakdown as like Marx talked about, as like base structure and superstructure, I guess.
Yeah.
So the book sort of tries to go through that systematically. I look at the changes we need to make to our technical infrastructure to avoid self-destruction, then the changes that we'd have to make to our political economic system to bring about those technical changes, and then the changes that would have to happen in consciousness, cultures, value, ideology, beliefs, myths, which I think to a large extent are, indoctrinated into people, programmed and conditioned through, the media. I really like Antonio Negri talks about how, post-modern civilization, we shifted from the hegemony of material production to the hegemony of immaterial production. And in a time when immaterial production, like, ideas, networks, narratives, ways of conducting effective relationships, when that's the hegemonic form of production, then what's ultimately getting produced is subjectivity itself. So the whole
social media.
The whole social media and mass media machine is constantly imprinting and re-imprinting certain forms of subjectivity.
Yeah.
But the subjectivity that's being imprinted and re-imprinted is passive, cynical, disempowered, detached, consumerist. And in a way, the powers, the elite rulers, let's say, have made a goof. They made a major error in judgment because that form of subjectivity is no longer going to help us get through this situation where we actually are going to need, to kind of get people back into participatory, autonomous, leadership mentality. Much more like tribal societies had.
Right, a kind of a collective engagement in in a project that everybody's a part of.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't have that.
Exactly.
I mean, even the Marxists and radicals want that. In terms of even if it's just a New Deal project,
right?
Whatever it might be, I think there is a sense that we need something like that.
Well, the first thing that is so hard for most people to reckon with is, that we have, unleashed this ecological emergency,
right?
Where we're losing 10% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity every 10 to 15 years.
And we're in a mass extinction event, right?
Well, that's what I'm talking about. 150 species a day out of 8.2 million estimated total species. That's 10% of the remaining Earth's biodiversity every 10 to 15 years. We're seeing all this forest fires, deforestation. The oceans are 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. It's now estimated that, all of the coral reefs on Earth will be dead by 2065, and they hold a lot of the ocean's biodiversity, and so on. And then, the projections now would be, the last time there was 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, we had 4 degrees Celsius warmer temperature, and the sea levels were 100 feet higher. So that's where we're headed right now. But the thing is that it doesn't just happen, even that doesn't happen on a smooth curve, because what actually we've learned from studying past thresholds of mass extinction is there's a huge amount of methane, which is frozen under the oceans into the Siberian permafrost, and as the warming starts, that starts to erupt in large quantities. So methane, there's 100 gigatons or something. Methane is only lasts in the atmosphere for 10 years, whereas CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for about 100 years. But the methane is 30 times more potent as a heat-trapping gas than CO2. So that would lead to a spike of another 8 degrees, up to 8 degrees Celsius temperature warmer, which is what caused the Permian mass extinction 250 million years ago. And when that happened, it didn't happen over 1,000 years. It happened over 100 or 50 years or something.
Yeah.
So, and we can see all around us that, the way things are changing, it's getting more and more haywire, quickly. So, if we're actually going to, avert something at that level, which would make agriculture basically impossible, which would, lead to massive, refugee populations, which would lead to nuclear-armed states going berserk.
I mean, we're already seeing that, aren't we?
We're already seeing the edge of it, but we're not. It's just going to go deeper down the spiral.
A lot of people, I think, don't understand that. Even the situation in Syria and the refugee crisis in Syria and coming out of Syria into Europe is in part a climate emergency. This started with a famine and drought, right? Yeah,
exactly.
I mean,
which then led to Brexit. Because the English don't want to have the refugees coming in.
Yeah, I mean, you can really see all of this stuff you're talking about connecting very, very quickly together. I mean, one of the things you write about in your first book is 9/11 being a kind of moment that kind of blew your mind. You were here in Manhattan. You kind of the building shook when this happened. was it kind of like an event that was right in your face? I mean, I feel like 9/11 in part contributed to my perception that we're living in this kind of like transformative moment, or kind of like a moment where, I mean, I guess McKenna had the idea of like novelty increasing. Is that something you feel still is like a unique moment we're in, or you feel like it's all moments in a sense, if that makes sense? Like, in other words, there's always been a kind of potential for this kind of transformation. Things have always been this crazy. It's tricky, right?
It's tricky. I mean, well, I guess, yeah. I mean, I guess that I think that everything points towards this being a threshold of, intensifying change and transformation, and that change, as Jung talks about, is ultimately happening in the nature of the psyche, and so, and we don't really know what the endpoint will be, one of my, theories, which will probably once again offend the leftist radicals in the crowd, is that it may be that, one reason we've subconsciously self-willed an ecological megacrisis is to access the latent powers of the psyche, particularly ESP and paranormal and psychic abilities.
I love that.
And so, for instance, like, in the 2012 book, I talked about the Hopi in Arizona, and this anthropologist lived with them for many years, and he had to admit, even though he was a skeptic and empiricist, that sometimes it seemed like their rain dances would work to change the weather. And so maybe we're pushing ourselves to this edge, into this liminal zone. So somehow we use now our more developed technical abilities and a kind of expanded kind of idea of rationality, but to actually, enhance our psychic capacities.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing idea. I mean, the idea, like you had mentioned at the beginning of our talk, that our culture is currently, a suicide machine, and that we're heading towards this kind of maybe unavoidable catastrophe. Do you think it really is unavoidable? Do you feel like, is there a contradiction in the kind of sense of like feeling like it kind of has to happen?
Well, the only way to avoid it, I mean, I don't think there's any known material way to, stop the ice caps from collapsing at this point.
Yeah.
So, unless we develop either some transformative technology beyond what I've even heard anyone talk about, or we somehow develop our psychic powers as a collective, I don't see how we stop, this city and all these other cities being underwater, within a century.
Well, I mean, and I don't think that's contradicted by the mainstream media. I mean, the things that you were talking about in terms of the kind of like what's actually happening to the climate and what's happening to the Earth right now in terms of methane and everything else. I mean, that's on the cover of the New York Times. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, New York Times is kind of like, I've shown it to people, and it's kind of like a blankness when you bring this up, that this is not like some black helicopter website I'm on that's talking about this stuff. This is mainstream science has basically agreed that in 50 years, New York City is going to be significantly impacted by rising water. So on this show, we've mentioned many times like the word apocalypse comes up, because whether you're a psychedelic thinker or a non-psychedelic thinker, I think many people would agree that we're in a kind of apocalyptic moment. And I know that's a word that you've written a lot about. Do you still is the concept of apocalypse still operative for you? Is it still something that is useful to you to think about?
Yes.
What do you mean by apocalypse?
Well, I mean, the word apparently literally means revealing or uncovering. So it's a time, everything becomes known and transparent. And I think that's, very much happening, once again, because of the social networks and the social media. So, WikiLeaks dumping, all of the emails, from the diplomats and from Hillary Clinton. So you can just actually just see for yourself what the inner workings are. You don't have to guess anymore, and for me, it's also part of that revealing is, has to do with, I guess, this integration of the world's esoteric systems and modern technoscience.
See that when most people hear the word apocalypse, they think end of the world, zombies, skyscrapers falling. But that's not that's not your perception of apocalypse at all, it sounds like.
Um,
In other words, apocalypse as just pure catastrophe.
yeah, I mean, isn't that more Armageddon?
Yeah, I guess you're right.
We're probably going to get some Armageddon along with our apocalypse.
Yeah.
It's like, what's the peanut butter and the chocolate that go great
right.
together?
Yeah. Armageddon and yeah, well, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is that, I mean, in part, as much as I think your new book, How Soon Is Now, is about kind of what can we do right now to kind of mitigate or ameliorate what's coming, and make it less shitty, if I can put it in a very colloquial way. But at the same time, it seems like you think that the catastrophe is almost necessary for human beings to make the kind of psychic changes that you'd like to see.
Well, there's the distinction between me as squeamish little Daniel Pinchbeck, a normal person who has a child and wants things to stay stable.
Yeah.
And me as like the thinker philosopher who kind of worked out the kind of hypothesis of what this all could be.
You know what it reminds me of? It because whenever I read your work, because it seems like you are torn between two worlds in a sense of like kind of like that like psychonaut explorer of philosophical ideas, and really I do think of you as a political thinker in a lot of ways, and then also just a human being with desires and with a family and with things that you have to do every day. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of, to bring it full circle back to the Beat Generation, it reminds me of Big Sur, the Kerouac book, where he's kind of like, he wants very badly to like be a Buddhist and escape into the woods and be by himself and meditate, and he's very attracted to that world and he thinks it's necessary for him and valuable to him. But then when he gets out there, like all he can think about is like going back to the city and like hitting the bars and hitting on girls. Is that like a conflict that you found difficult to navigate in your own life? The kind of like being torn between kind of living as a person, but also recognizing the system is so toxic and wanting to change it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we didn't get into it in this conversation, but particularly I feel that whole area of love and relationships and sexuality is a whole nother area that's mission critical to look at from a systemic viewpoint. I mean, in the new book, I have a whole section around that, talking about my own mistakes and errors in judgment, and then also talking about a community that I've been visiting in Portugal called Timera, started by German radicals who were trying to figure out why the kind of utopian experiments of the 60s failed or didn't work out, and they began to realize that it was core issues around love and sexuality, which were like the deepest political issues that people weren't yet at the level of awareness or self-consciousness to bring up and address properly. So they created like a social laboratory for community based on non-possessive, transparent relating.
Trying to overcome all the I don't know, transpersonal issues with monogamy, it sounds like.
Exactly,
right? Yeah, I mean, and it's I think it's maybe the most quote unquote controversial issue I ever bring up whenever I'm teaching is gender, sexuality. I mean, we're living in a moment where feminism has kind of entered the cultural conversation in different ways right now. But do you feel like that's part of it? That's something that's going on in the culture, is that there is an engagement with that stuff? Because it's weird because we live in a culture that's very hypersexualized, yet strangely Victorian at the same time, and very pro-monogamy.
Yeah, totally.
It's weird.
Yeah. Well, then obviously we're seeing this like acted out right now, on the big stage with, Hillary.
That's
and
right.
Bill Clinton. And his history, and Donald Trump and his history of sexual abuse, and then Roger Ailes, who's the demonic mastermind behind Fox, who turns out to be a serial abuser. I mean,
Bill Cosby.
There's Bill. Well, that's so there's obviously, in a patriarchal dominator society like the one we've constructed, that supports sociopathic behavior patterns. Men seek power for sexual gain, not just for monetary and political gain, and perhaps even that's the secret source of a lot of it. So if you could create a social model where everybody was able to satiate those desires without exploitation, that would already be a way to maybe overturn the system.
Yeah, it's almost a sense that we all have that, like, when you talk about, the Illuminati, or even just whoever is in control, there's this always idea of like those men are in rooms doing like eyes wide shut cult sex, and it's like this feeling that like that's almost what it's all for.
Well,
to get them in those rooms.
Right. Well, we do know. I mean, like, there's this big scandal in Britain where all these, like, parliamentarians were actually doing, like, ritual child abuse, potentially even, like, murder of, sacrificial murder of children.
It's crazy shit. And a story that I don't think a lot of people know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to end on that note. But.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's part of what a larger kind of the idea of, like, revealing that you're talking about,
right.
This sense that like you can't hide anymore. And even, I mean, that even comes out in the kind of like just cultural savviness of young people that like see through shit very easily.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, even with this election, there's kind of like almost like a consensus among even the mainstream media that like both sides are just like blatantly corrupt, even though Hillary has a lot of cheerleaders in the mainstream media, but like either way, there's this sense that, okay, well, we know all the secrets now, but we're gonna move forward anyway, and it breeds a weird kind of cynicism too.
Yeah,
I mean, do you struggle with cynicism? Do you struggle with the idea of like feeling like it's hopeless? Is that something that you've overcome? And if so, tell me how.
Well, I don't think it matters, whether or not objectively it's hopeless.
Yeah.
I think that, what makes, the individual happy is to, feel that you're giving your gifts in the best way possible.
Right.
To bring about the world that you want to see.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I feel like the sense of relief from this last book took me a very long time and many failed efforts, but, at least I've put out, my best effort to say, like, to put it together. Like, this is how things would have to change. These are the different levers and mechanisms. And now, in a way, like, I can step back and it's kind of up to everybody else.
Right.
You can't, nobody can do everything.
No, it's true. And I mean, that's part of, I feel like it's a pressure you've put on yourself as a thinker, though, in some respects. Like, you're really aiming for something big here. I mean, you're really trying to contain all of it. It seems like your work is not like focused on one particular area of it, but really trying to come up with like a meta theory of like how we can move forward effectively through some really big crises that we're in the midst of.
Yeah, I mean, I had no idea when I started on this path that I would be trying to do anything like that.
Yeah.
But essentially, writing books for me comes from like almost like a very uncomfortable sense that there's like something missing. Like you go to a bookstore and it's like, where's that thing that like is going to explain like my mushroom trip to me,
right.
Or, after the mushroom trip, like why these indigenous cultures were focused on this time as a transformation and, or, our system is so fucked, what's the model that even encompasses what we now understand about consciousness and these other aspects of reality, into a kind of social political alternative, So for me, it's like it's very much just like if it had turned out that the piece of the puzzle that I had to do was on something much smaller, like romantic poets and their love lives or something, it would have been that. But for whatever reason, this was like the little
this is your thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I really, having thought and talked to so many people on this program about like how to change the world. I mean, there are so many different kind of ways of approaching that idea. I really appreciate the elements that you bring into it that aren't present in a lot of other critics. Like, I really appreciate that you talk about consciousness. I really appreciate you talk about psychedelic drugs and those kind of things. I think they are like really critical pieces of understanding what's happening. That we have to. It's an internal as well as an external process. In other words.
Absolutely.
Daniel Pinchbeck, thank you so much. I really appreciate sitting down with you. I really appreciate your ideas, and I'm looking forward to your book, How Soon Is Now, coming out next year. Thank you.
Yay. Bye.